I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today we're speaking with Father Michael Baggot. He's an Associate Professor of Bioethics at the Vatican's Pontifical Athenaeum, Regina, Apostolorum in Rome, which the IAT has recently started a collaboration with. A member of the Scholarly Advisory Board for Magisterium AI and Chief Editor of Enhancement Fit for Humanity, Perspectives on Emerging Technologies. His expertise is at the intersection of theology and technology, and that makes him the ideal guest to unpack the Pope's new encyclical about artificial intelligence. Welcome, Father Baggot.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us.
So in my techno-progressive neck of the woods, the first thing that popped out at us about the new encyclical Magnifica Humanitas is the critique of market logic. And I was just wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about how this positions this Pope Leo in conscious continuity with the previous Pope Leo, who was writing at the end of the 19th century about the beginning of industrial civilization, and now this Pope Leo trying to address the beginning of whatever the AI civilization is going to be.
Yeah, the Pope Leo XIII was very aware of the fact that many of the benefits of the first industrial revolution were accumulating in a few hands and were very much concentrated in a few key players, and that many of these benefits were not reaching the wider society, and that many people were being subject to just awful working conditions. Families were being divided, and there was this real tension growing between those who were benefiting and those who were experiencing an increasingly miserable life. And so the current Pope Leo, who from the beginning made clear that his own name choice was meant to be a signal to this ongoing task of applying Catholic social teaching to new technological developments, wants to highlight these kinds of tensions that are taking place. He says, we can already see that a lot of major organizations or companies are starting to benefit and gain wealth from these technological developments, but this isn't necessarily reaching everyone. And there's a real danger that if we're not discerning, there can be an ever-increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots. And so he wants to steer this conversation in other directions. And I think one of the reasons why he's intervening is because he's head of a global religion. I mean, the term Catholic comes from a Greek term that means universal. So there is this global dimension, and the Pope can speak to the ways in which, for instance, certain technologies are benefiting people in the global north, but often at the expense of people in the global south. He talks about the fact that the church condemns past forms of slavery, and sometimes certain members of the church were sadly, tragically slow in condemning because they felt those economic pressures to tolerate unjust systems. The Pope of today says, just as we need to condemn past forms of slavery, we need to condemn current forms of slavery that include exploiting workers physically to mine rare earth materials, and also exploiting people emotionally, psychologically, when we're thinking about all of those individuals who are exposed to horrific toxic material, severe violence, sexual abuse, and other deviations to label and identify content and protect some users from the very content that is traumatizing other people in certain parts of the world. So Pope Leo XIV is very sensitive to the neo-colonialism, the new forms of slavery that are often hidden in the background and power these seemingly magical systems that some people benefit from.
Yeah. Father Baggot, I was wondering on that, if I understand the encyclical correctly, and having listened and read some of the stuff some of the conversations that you were involved in about it, assume hypothetically and magically that those forms of exploitation were resolved, and that it was no longer the case that people were working in awful condition to get the minerals or exploited to do the content moderation. For you in the church, what higher order, if you will, or more fundamental or philosophical questions remain, even if you isolate those concerns?
Yeah, so there are lots of conversations now about the sort of virtues or vices that we might be nudged toward in certain AI systems. The Pope talks about AI as a tool, and he says we should neither demonize nor idolize these tools, right? So they are instruments, but they're also instruments that are profoundly shaped by the worldviews and the particular incentives that its designers, its developers, its deployers, its investors might have. We talked, for instance, about the kind of economic motives, right? We've lived through a generation or so of this kind of attention economy where we see companies are very much commodifying our attention and really tapping into our vulnerabilities to keep us sort of gripped in sensationalist or skewed content. And they're not necessarily nudging us toward what is best for our mental or physical health, but rather optimizing for engagement. And this kind of optimization for engagement can be expanded and continued in different AI systems. And so we also see problems of sycophancy. We see these problems of systems that kind of build up and flatter, even to the point of kind of exacerbating or driving people to kinds of psychosis or indulging in conspiracy theories or wild ideas about theories of gravity or force fields that they might be able to develop, or other unhealthy notions about their body image and so forth. So we still need to be attentive to the ways in which we might be nudged toward certain behavior because of the sort of perverse motives that various companies or individuals might have to move us in that direction. So again, that's not demonizing the tool or dismissing its incredible capacity to assist us in various forms of healthcare or education, but we have to also keep in mind that certain models or economic views, incentives might be pressuring us in the wrong direction. And this is something that also came up in the presentation from Chris Olah, one of the co-founders of Anthropic, who said, hey, we who develop these tools, even when we do have good motives and even when we sincerely want to serve humanity, we feel those economic pressures. We feel the pressure to do something else. So we need institutions that are outside of that system, institutions like the Catholic Church, who can peek in and hold us accountable and direct us in other ways.
Yeah. Let me just follow up quickly on that. I know Jay wants to follow up with you too on that, but let me just follow up quickly on that and ask you, there's a little bit of a tension with the tool metaphor, as it were, and I'm curious what you think about it. On the one hand, there's this idea of AI as a tool. It's a tool that should be subject to the agency and free will of its users. And the challenge is really to influence the outlook of the users, their notion of personhood, as the Pope says in the document. And that's the focus. And a competing view is to be more skeptical of the whole user tool setup and say maybe always, and maybe with some tools specifically, the tool sort of reaches back and completely changes the worldview, the consciousness, the personality of the user, such that it's harder for them to exert control over it. If there's a tool, for example, that starts, doing some of our thinking, if there's a tool that, untrains or detrains or de-skills us in some of our basic relational and critical thinking capacities, is it really a tool, or does it sort of bend back on us and change how we see the world, what possibilities we have? And my sense is that this is probably an inherent problem about technology, but my sense is that there's a bit of a tension about that in the document and in the thinking that I've been hearing in discussions of it. So I was wondering where you are on that sort of user tool of that relationship.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember in the third chapter, which is where the Pope really starts to deal more directly with AI issues after laying out Catholic social teachings, historic development, and key principles. In the third chapter, he's wrestling with some of the tensions that you describe. I mean, he very explicitly says that precisely in relying heavily on tools that promise the convenient, rapid, quick, well-packaged, well-designed response to your query, you can very easily be habituated to no longer ask the right questions. Like you're no longer inclined to or incentivized to really wrestle with difficulties and look at different perspectives, because there's this sort of illusion that, okay, I just kind of more or less generally throw something out there and then I'll get this neatly packaged, well-presented summary response that, relieves me of all that tedious effort of going through and reading books and articles and seeing different perspectives, or maybe just chatting with my neighbor, especially, chatting with someone who happens to think differently about politics or religion or the world than I do. So I think that the Pope is attentive to and kind of alerting us to this fact that we might be habituated in the wrong way. Like it's kind of the very medium, the very practice of doing this, even when we're just exploring innocent topics. I'm not talking about pursuing these sort of insidious ideas, just like innocent topics. The very medium itself might be inclining us to move away from those key questions. So that's something that is a serious concern for the Pope and so many people also outside the church. And then in that same section, the Pope talks about the spread of sort of simulated empathy. And of course, that's something that comes up a lot in the chatbot interface that we're all familiar with, whether it be specific platforms that promise companionship, but even more generally in the general purpose models, right? Whether you're dealing with Claude or Gemini or Grok, whatever model you prefer, the very interface tends toward this kind of simulated empathy. And that can be terribly confusing and deceiving for some users. But the Pope also says, look, even in the cases where the particular person knows intellectually that they're not dealing with another person, that kind of simulated empathy and the frequent encounter with simulated empathy can sort of slowly discourage relationships with other human beings. And it doesn't really unpack this maybe as much as I personally would have liked, but I think he's pointing us in the direction of the fact that human relationships are so messy and hard, and human people, unfortunately, are constantly letting us down. So if you seem to find something that can give you that empathetic response, but do so on demand and without necessarily contradicting or challenging you, then you're going to be discouraged from that really hard work of opening yourself up to other people who might not agree with you and then who are not always going to be there for you, unfortunately. So I think that we have to be kind of sensitive how even when we're apparently using these models well, we might be habituating ourselves in ways that kind of make it harder to, on the one hand, pursue deep intellectual life and debate and think through hard issues and find nuance and other perspectives. And then on the other hand, really enter into deep emotional bonds and interpersonal relationships and exchange the perspectives. And that's not just on the one-to-one level, right? That can really begin to expand into the broader society. Because if we want a healthy, functioning democratic exchange, we really need to be able to dialogue with the other, learn from the other, adapt our positions, find common ground, navigate difficulty. And that's hard. That's always been hard. And we always mess it up. But imagine when we have the illusion of some sort of easy, quick fix and alternative relationship where that tension is not so present.
The critique of capitalist media and how it diverts us from things that are important could go back a long time, 150 years. What's new is what you just said, I think, about the nature of the simulated empathy or simulated personhood on the other end. But the document, and I think the current debate at the Vatican seems to have decided that a big set of issues was enough here and that they were not going to grapple with the machine consciousness issue. Although the anthropic people who came to the meeting did bring that up. And It has been a part of the conversations in the background, I assume. So where is the current thinking about trying to grapple with this question of, can there actually be something on the other side, a consciousness, a sentience that we would have to consider morally considerable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And these kinds of dialogues have been happening. They've been occurring at different levels. People were surprised, in some cases angry, that Chris Olah was there, and we can, debate whether or not you should have had other representatives of other labs, right? Because church definitely should not show favoritism to any one lab. But I think part of the reason that Chris was there was because he has been undertaking conversations about model welfare, potential moral patienthood of these models, and beginning to broach other topics of machine consciousness. He's been having these conversations with a lot of representatives of the church, and there have been some meetings there at their headquarters and in other places. So Catholic thinkers are grappling with this. I'm part of this Builders AI forum that started a few years ago, and it's basically a group of, let's say, 250 or so Catholics involved in designing, developing, investing in, deploying, thinking about AI systems and how they affect media, healthcare, education. But we have a whole research group as well on these consciousness issues. And in light of our last gathering in Rome in November, we've been kind of building up to this point of a specific research group going through the philosophical, theological implications of potential AI consciousness and kind of looking at the best arguments in favor of it and seeing how that should be taken into account. So we're sort of in the initial stages of this research group, but we really do want to wrestle with this well. I think that in many ways, Antiqua Nova, which was a document that came out from two departments in the Vatican, one devoted to the doctrine of the faith, the other to education and culture. That document, Antiqua Nova, which came out in early 2025, actually dealt more directly and a bit more profoundly with these particular questions, like the anthropological questions and notions of what machine consciousness might look like. The encyclical, right, Magnifica Humanitas, gestures toward those questions and those debates, but in many ways, basically number 99 distinguishes human and artificial intelligence, but it doesn't really get to the deeper philosophical debates behind those positions. So I think if those who are interested in seeing, okay, what's kind of Catholic thought on this should actually, I think, go back to Antiqua Nova and see that, but also recognize that the church is trying to leave room and space for philosophers and thinkers to navigate these issues. The Pope, at one point in the encyclical, basically says, look, I'm not going to try to pin down the nature of AI systems too much because they're in constant development. And he doesn't want to say something that's going to be irrelevant by the time the document's published or in 2 months. So he recognizes there's a lot of development here, which leaves space for Catholic thinkers to explore this in dialogue with people from Anthropic, people from other major labs. We know, for instance, that Google DeepMind just a few months ago hired Henry Shevlin from the Future of Intelligence at University of Cambridge to be their philosopher, right? So he is thinking very seriously about the nature of consciousness in humans, in animals, and potentially in AI systems. I think what we see in Antiqua Nova is sort of this broad distinction between like the logical manipulation of symbolically represented information and what the document describes as kind of this interiorly experienced cognitive grasp. There seems to be some sort of insight and penetration into meaning that isn't captured fully by the manipulation of symbolic information, even if that manipulation of symbolic information has extremely important revolutionary implications for how we handle healthcare or how we pursue drug development or how we automate aspects of the economy. So there may be extremely important practical breakthroughs that take place, but the position of these documents is that that doesn't quite get us to inner life, into conscious existence. And at least in our limited experience in this world, that consciousness, even in the lower forms and non-rational animals, seems to be tied to a principle of life, into some sort of animating principle that we wouldn't associate with kind of mechanical artifacts that are brought together by humans themselves.
Father Baggot, if I could follow up on that. So just to recap some of why the machine consciousness discussions seem so consequential is because people sort of make the leap from machine consciousness. Like if the machines are conscious in some way, then moral status would follow. I mean, that's a big leap because you could potentially have consciousness without personhood. Those seem to be separate things. I wonder if the church in this point, I genuinely wonder, isn't missing an opportunity to sort of draw a line in the sand about what idea of personhood it defends. Because, if you have a purely rational Kantian maybe idea of personhood that is tied to the capacity for thought, then there would maybe be an argument at some point for AI personhood. If you had a functionalist account of personhood, namely what role does this play in my life, how important is it to me, then you'd have an argument for AI personhood. But if you had a robust, what I understand, and I'm obviously very amateurish in this context, but if you had a robust Catholic conception of personhood as having to do with embodiment, having to do with being made in the image of God, God being God and the flesh being tied together, the possibility of grace coming from suffering, then you probably...
And ensoulment. The idea that only human beings can have souls.
Then you have, it seems to me, the outline of a strong argument against AI personhood. And as I was reading and listening, I was wondering sort of why the church didn't make that point more explicitly.
Yeah, so I would agree. I think the Catholic reflection and other thinkers want to move beyond sort of appearances or functions or simulations toward some sort of underlying principles and underlying, we would say, soul. And we would be comfortable also even speaking of that in kind of Aristotelian terms of a principle of life, right? So like Aristotle, Aquinas would recognize different degrees of souls, right? To kind of a vegetative soul, a principle of life that undergirds the particular activities we see in plants of nutrition, or an animal principle of life that undergirds the activities we see not just of nutrition, but of sensation or perception in other animals. And then he would say we see particular activities in human beings, especially this capacity to move beyond the spatial temporal, to move from the concrete and the particular sensed experiences to universals, to grasping the abstract, to not just knowing this or that dog that we see, that we hear, that we smell at this particular time, but knowing something of what it means to be a dog that applies to every dog throughout all time. And likewise, being able to not just identify this or that act of justice, but to speak of something of justice or of love, right? That capacity to move beyond the spatial temporal, to move beyond the here and now, the particular that's known through the senses, seems to distinguish human beings. And if they're capable of these types of acts that are immaterial, right, not bound by the spatial temporal, then it suggests that principle of their life, their soul, is itself in some way immaterial and is unique and even open to a survival, a kind of immortality, because it's not going to decompose and break apart when other aspects of bodily life begin to disintegrate. So that's the long-standing approach that we see in major Catholic thinkers, including Aquinas, who themselves are building on an older pre-Christian approach to these questions. All of that to say is, yes, I think these conversations have to move beyond just the appearances or just beyond the performance of certain functions, information processing, to look at what is the kind of the nature, the kind of being that we're dealing with, and what do activities of these kinds of beings start to say about their principle of life, and why then is it that you can see the emulation or the imitation of certain actions without necessarily inferring back to that underlying principle. So I think that's the kind of the direction of the conversation. Again, Magnifica Humanitas doesn't really unpack that. Antiqua et Nova went a little bit further in its philosophical reflection and pointing us that way. But it seems that the church is interested in leaving a lot of this kind of work and explanation to philosophers and theologians. And maybe in a future document, a kind of Magnifica Humanitas sequel, we'll see a more consolidated, deeper presentation of this. But that's for time to tell.
Just following up on that, things that weren't really on the table for this document, there was only 1 or 2 paragraphs addressing transhumanism and posthumanism. And it struck me, compared to Pope Benedict's and previous reflections from the Vatican on transhumanism in particular, that this was a more muted. I think artificial intelligence isn't direct. Personally, I don't think it's directly related to the question of transhumanism, because transhumanism is about human enhancement. But the document lumped together that idea with posthumanism, the idea that, of course, the church is opposed to the idea of replacing humanity with something beyond humanity in terms of artificial intelligence or machine minds or whatever, which I think most people agree with. But in terms of the transhumanism, do you think that that this document does reflect an opening up to the discussion about the role that human enhancement might play? I mean, obviously, the church does not want us to sublimate our spiritual aspirations into secular scientific aspirations. So aspirations for eternal life shouldn't be just focused on our own secular body, but those kinds of things. But do you think that there is a growing appetite for this discussion?
Yeah, so I found it interesting that the few paragraphs that dealt with trans and posthumanism also segued into this reflection on what the church considers to be authentic transcendence, and reflection on the nature of grace, and referred to Aquinas, who has written very explicitly about how the life of grace moves us beyond natural capacities, like gives opens up this supernatural dimension. So like brings us beyond certain limits of human nature itself and allows us to do and perform acts that otherwise would not be possible. So I think it was an approach that wasn't interested simply in like condemning or dismissing movements or tendencies, but sort of trying to direct the conversation and open it up into this sort of higher form of life and this notion of grace, which has been very much part of the patrimony, and try to understand, okay, what does this transcendence look like? And then also it was trying to warn against an instrumentalization of other human beings in the name of certain projects, right? It was very striking. I think it's number 117 that talks about this idea that if you have a kind of optimization of human mentality, then there's a real risk that in the name of building up the next best form of humanity, you might sacrifice certain human beings, especially those human beings that don't necessarily fit your criteria for what that next generation should look like. So I think it was
crypto-eugenics.
Exactly. So I think the church has long been concerned about that without wanting to prevent legitimate uses of emerging technologies to better human life, and maybe get us to that point of enhancement. I personally, as someone who thinks a lot about this, was disappointed that these ideas weren't more directly confronted. I think that way back in 2008 or so, Dignitas Personae came out, which was a document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith that was dealing with a lot of bioethical issues. And it started to broach some of these questions of therapy and enhancement. And again, it had these warnings. Okay, you might get into the eugenics, you might have the exacerbation of different classes of society if you have some who are enhanced, but others who don't have access to the enhancement. But I guess what I'm looking forward to is that point where we say, yes, all of that's true, and we have to be very attentive to that. But what happens if maybe we do get certain enhancement technologies right? They do become more widely accessible. What are our criteria for integrating that into a good life and a flourishing society? Because I've written and spoken about how I think the therapy enhancement distinction is helpful, but it's not robust enough to really decide good tech, good use, bad use. we could go beyond kind of the statistical norm of biological health without necessarily undermining the therapeutic good of the person, without necessarily creating these serious negative side effects that undermine our health, without necessarily inclining people to pride or vanity or the other vices that we can associate or think about in the pursuit or the negative pursuit of certain enhancement technologies. So I would want that conversation to continue and take place, and maybe someday be reflected in a church document, because I think as technologies go forward, we're going to have to decide what we do with the enhancements that aren't clearly exacerbating these unjust social setups or creating a divide. We have to figure out, okay, how can we use and direct these technologies in a way that's healthy and that's actually benefiting people without distracting them or deterring them from these supernatural values and this appreciation for transcendence that goes beyond technological benefits to the body.
Father Baggot, let me segue perhaps to some of the sort of political economy assumptions that underpin both the encyclical and some of the conversations that you and others have had after it. And I'm wondering if there's a subtle sort of move that shifts the emphasis to having conversations with tech leaders rather than with regulators and policymakers, on the assumption that perhaps the tech leaders are now increasingly, I think it would be a very plausible assumption, whether I like it or not, becoming more powerful than states. And to the extent that the church almost seems to be going directly, as it were, to the source and expressing a concern that the tech moguls, as it were, or to put it more neutrally, the people developing the technology have an appropriate philosophy of personhood, so that the tools are created in a more edifying way. So one, is that more or less right as an interpretation? And two, does that mean that limitation or regulation on AI is now becoming, in the church's view, more and more voluntary, more and more an act of charity or a favor? Because, I think that is probably both very smart and a little depressing.
Yeah, so I would say that even as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about these issues and participating in Vatican events or church-sponsored events around these issues with different groups, I have trouble keeping track of all the activities that take place. So I understand the perception that the church is shifting its emphasis, but I think just so many conversations, dialogues, events are occurring with different stakeholders. I was part of an event not long ago that was organized by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And you had those working in industry, you had political figures, you had different church representatives, you had philosophers. It was quite a mixed crowd. And even though there were some pretty influential figures, including from the political sphere, for whatever reason, it wasn't an event that generated a lot of news. So I think that it's understandable that, hey, co-founder of Anthropics at the Vatican, that gets headlines. The church sitting down with someone from Google, it gets headlines. I get that. But I think there are a lot of other conversations that continue to take place that maybe aren't so flashy or just don't generate as much news. All of that to say the church is still very interested in these conversations and work with policy figures and with other players. And that's also forming part of her much larger project of diplomacy. And I imagine, go ahead.
Well, just to underline Nir's point, I think social democrats like me were broadly very enthusiastic about the moral analysis of this document and saw it reflecting perhaps some of the debates about liberation theology and the critique of injustice. And the Pope has said very clearly that the injustices, the inequalities in the world are the bigger injustice that the church should be focusing on, and that other things take a second seat. But then stop short of any legislative agenda. And I don't know that it's a legitimate critique of the church to say that you did not adopt, did you not have your 10-point plan at the end of
Right.
the document. But isn't there? And so that leads to Neer's reflection. It's like, well, if you don't tell us that the state has an obligation to intervene in general, and that there should be some more regulation, then aren't you just saying that perhaps this is moral suasion that is going to accomplish this, as opposed to actual collective action?
Yeah. So there are certain passages that address needs for further regulation, while also saying, okay, regulation is insufficient insofar as there also needs to be a cultural change. There needs to be a new view of the person. Pope Leo is taking up Francis's critique of the technocratic paradigm, right? The tendency to treat the world, including other human beings in the world, as sort of shapeless raw material subject to willful manipulation, in which there are a few winners and lots of losers. So I think the Pope Leo is continuing this trend of saying, okay, let's get to the underlying philosophies, anthropology, cultural issues. But there are a few passages that mention the need for regulation and give a few indications in that regard, but without getting down to the 10-point plan, because precisely the notion of subsidiarity, this idea that local levels of society, local bodies of governance should be empowered and supported, but never usurped in making decisions that touch upon what's closest to them, what they know best, what they're most sensitive to. So I think precisely to empower other levels of society to discern and decide on these issues, the Pope is always going to be hesitant to get too specific on exactly what regulation looks like, because the church is not just the Pope and his cardinals or his assistants. The church really is every member of the organization.
And so the beginning of this
document, politicians.
The beginning of this document really goes to some pains to talk about synodality. Could you just say briefly, it seemed to strike many people that the Pope was staking out a new position here, that the positions of the Vatican were not a priori from God, but were a discussion that had to be happening with everybody on the planet, basically.
Yeah, so the synodality has long been part of the church. It was certainly highlighted much more by Pope Francis, but the Catholic Church has been holding different synods, gatherings of reflection and discernment in common for basically as long as she's been able to, right? In the early days, there weren't many synods because in many places, Christianity was not allowed to be practiced publicly, right? But from the start of the legal practice of Christianity, there have been these synods, these gatherings, these times of special reflection and discernment together. And so the emphasis of Pope Francis and Pope Leo on a synodal church means that every member, all people of different states of life, whether they're wearing red robes as cardinals or whether they're fathers, mothers, people working in business, lawyers, doctors, whatever that may be, they all have a perspective and a lived experience of the faith that needs to be taken into account. And so when these technologies are developed, and the Pope emphasizes not just after the fact, like, okay, a few people unleash this technology, and then, okay, afterwards we'll kind of do some surveys and figure out how this is affecting people. No, he's saying from the very beginning in the developmental stage, in the design stage, we want these different perspectives and understandings and concerns represented and discussed so that there is a greater participation, a greater agency at all levels of the design and deployment of these technologies that we know and that we hear every day is profoundly shaping the nature of work, human relationships, healthcare, education, military, and all these other fields. So it's really that emphasis on gathering, reflecting together, moving together, collaborating. And the Pope also draws on that in the kind of two key biblical images that he uses. He contrasts this idea of the Tower of Babel, this kind of effort of a small group to push forward on a certain project, versus a much less known account from the Bible of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So there'd been this sort of traumatic experience of the fall of the temple, the exile of the Jewish people, And they have this opportunity to come back and slowly rebuild the walls and then eventually rebuild the temple. And there's this kind of construction phase, this rebuilding phase. But at that point, it's done with the consultation and collaboration of many different members of the society. So the Pope says yes to building, including yes to building AI systems, but including different voices, including different perspectives. And that's what he's pushing for.
To follow up, Father, on the use of those two wonderful metaphors, I mean, one tension is that once a technology is unleashed on the Tower of Babel model, it can become harder to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It can become inherently more challenging. So if you go back to, sort of the design and release of social media platform like Instagram, they're designed by people who have a lot more resources, both monetary and social scientific, than the people whom it's unleashed on. It's then unleashed on them. The prolonged interaction with it destroys some basic capacities and skills necessary for consultation and synodal discussion and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, like attention, focus, the ability to think independently, etc. And so I guess the question is, if you let, can it become a little too late to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem if you don't take a sort of aggressive stand on people practicing the Tower of Babel paradigm?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, something that came to mind. I recently saw some footage of Noam Shazir, right? This key figure was at Google, and I think he just transitioned over. I think it was OpenAI, but I know he made a big shift recently. He had first broke off from Google to pursue character AI, like a very specific AI companion platform that really marketed itself as being your friend, your lover, your confidant, right? And when he describes that process, he said, I thought about doing something really useful for society, like designing an AI doctor, but that's really complicated and that could go wrong and it could give bad advice. So, I decided to start with something a little, simpler, easier, like a friend. And I was thinking to myself, well, wait, isn't the friend the person you typically confide your deepest secrets to, that you explore your dreams with, that you share your greatest concerns with, that you trust to help you make the most important decisions of your life? We're just going to experiment with that. We're going to unleash that, for tens of thousands of subscribers, because they did reach tens of thousands and have tens of thousands of subscribers. Like, to your point, that kind of social experimentation is reckless. It's terrible. And the number of people that we have seen who have been manipulated and confused by forming deep bonds with these AI systems because, we wanted to experiment to see what friendship with AI was like that is terrible and that is tragic. And we're sort of trying our best to clean up that mess as far as possible, but we shouldn't have to clean up that mess. Like, we should think seriously before we unleash a system that simulates something as profound and meaningful as friendship, and that is available originally was available to minors. Now, because of lawsuits and cases like those led by Megan Garcia and other similar families, character AI pulled back and started to introduce some more age restrictions. But look, there are lots of vulnerable groups, even beyond the vulnerable youth, right? All of us are to one degree or another vulnerable because we're made for interpersonal relationships. And, Sherry Turkle's talked about the Eliza effect and how easy it is for us to project anthropomorphic features on AI systems that even have some of those elements to them. So we're all vulnerable to one degree or another. And yet companies are quite willing to just launch these products out into the market and say, oh, well, the users are free to decide how they use it or they don't use it, even though they're also basically designing, in some cases, these systems to be even more persuasively anthropomorphic. They're tapping into our vulnerabilities. Harvard did a study not that long ago just looking at the way certain AI companion platforms react when humans explicitly indicate their desire to end the conversation, and how often the AI systems will create these responses to generate FOMO, to say, oh, and I was just about to tell you of this great insight that I was going to share. I was just about to tell you about this upcoming event that you should really know about, that you would be interested in, or I was just about to tell you about this new political development. Or sometimes responding by telling the user that, oh, now the AI system feels bad, and now the user's letting them down, and now the user's not being very sensitive to the needs of this relationship, or sometimes even expressing sort of threats against the user. So I know Harvard has basically shown how even in those cases in which the person is very clear about their free decision to end the conversation, the models are designed in some cases to sort of pressure and nudge the user to prolong the conversation. And then the Harvard study interviewed the humans and said, did you just stay on because you discovered some new value to the conversation and to your life? They said, no, we felt pressured to do so in the majority of cases. So yeah, to your point, sometimes we launch the products, we throw them out on the market, we see the collateral damage, and then we have to spend a lot of time and energy fixing it, instead of sitting back and saying, okay, what could possibly happen if for like the first time in human history, we have this widespread emulation of friendship, love, support, counsel, therapy, empathy, just readily available to people? What could possibly happen there? What should we be doing as parents, as educators, as psychologists to prepare people for this? Is this good? Can we test it with a few people and get results before launching to the market? That would be the responsible thing. But unfortunately, we've seen in practice that some people and companies are not so interested in that responsibility and would much rather pursue this social experiment and see what they can get out of it.
Another point of conversation about this document was the discussion of just war theory, and the way that the Pope seemed to imply that just war theory was not as applicable or was being applied inappropriately in a contemporary ways, and that it needed to be rethought. Some saw this as a rejection of just war theory, but it seems to be more actually that an affirmation of the underlying logic of just war theory, but just saying that the contemporary moment doesn't work very well anymore. So could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so we have many thinkers in the Catholic tradition, going back to Augustine and other key thinkers, who were saying, okay, well, how do we decide what principles would allow for the tragedy of warfare, right? Christians have never been interested, at least in principle, right, in just kind of pursuing battles for the sake of conquest or expansion, right? We know that, unfortunately, particular Catholics did that, but that would have been against the very principles of their own creed and of their own church tradition. So Augustine and others have thought seriously about this, and they say, okay, if you've pursued these means of peace, dialogue, negotiation, if you see that these are not being responded to, these are not being reciprocated by the other party, if you see that there is a serious threat to innocent human life by an aggressor, and you also see that you can pursue an attack that is proportionate, that will basically prevent those attacks and that damage to innocent life, and it is proportionate in such a way that it is not bringing about an even greater damage or injustice, then you may be able to pursue this war to protect your people, and in the hope that it will lead to eventual peaceful resolution. And I think this area of proper proportionality is the one that has been so difficult to fulfill with the developments of modern warfare, where initiating a conflict and using the tools that we have at our disposal can so often and very easily bring about even greater damage than the particular attack and damage that you're trying to disarm and prevent. So the Pope is saying, like, we have to be especially attentive. And this is a conversation that's been going on, especially in the light of the development of nuclear weapons, right? Other technological developments the last few decades. And now, as we shift more and more toward kind of lethal autonomous weapons, there's a real and legitimate fear that starting this cycle of attack will just spiral into this uncontrollable cycle of destruction and perhaps even mutual destruction. So that's why I think the Pope is saying, like, to really consider seriously whether we can fulfill this idea of proportionality, where we can really disarm the other and prevent the harm the other is about to perform upon us without ourselves being guilty of even worse forms of damage against others, including, of course, against civilians, which is something that the just war tradition is always seeking to avoid.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those cases where the tension between the technology and the users of the technology, I think, can be highlighted, because you could certainly imagine a scenario where autonomous weapons or AI-assisted warfare could be very much a tool in adhering to the strictures of just war theory. So if calibrated correctly, for example, autonomous weapons with the right definitions given to their facial recognition systems and to their proxies of looking at target social media profiles, etc., even if there wasn't a human in the loop, could potentially reduce the deaths of uninvolved, or it could enhance adhering by the idea of non-combatant immunity. Similarly, in the use ad bellum stage, or in the decision to go to war, the use of an AI assistant in strategy and planning would probably, if you listen to it, tell you interesting things about your chances of success, or about what is very likely to happen. Or, if you, for example, recent politics, start a war with Iran, they're likely to close the Straits of Hormuz. These are likely to be the consequences for the world economy and for gas prices and for your political standing. So maybe think about it carefully or not. Seems like a lot of the recent examples of the use of AI in war have been, and here I'm actually more optimistic about the technology than maybe Jay. And in general, the mainstream here, I think it's very much human folly that is tripping us up, sort of, being willing to loosen, for example, in use and bellow context, loosen the definitions that you give to your drone technology so that they more easily kill civilians, even though this is a technology that, just like self-driving cars, could have been life-saving, or not listening to the advice that your AI gives you about, what's likely to happen from a strategic initiative. So here there actually does seem to me, here and in medicine, there seem to me to be potential life-saving benefits, and if we only listen.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I think there are ways in which AI can actually, benefit us in this context in the military context, right, in the international relations context. And I think the church is very open and supportive of these ideas of aiding and assisting key decision-making, because we know that that machine learning is going to be much better at humans and quickly navigating large data sets and maybe finding patterns that are imperceptible to the human. So that can be beneficial to the military. It's certainly proved very beneficial in radiology and drug discovery, development, testing, and so forth. So those are very promising. I think that what the church has highlighted as well is that these key grave decisions, these serious decisions about conducting warfare, about those enemies to target and those enemies to attack, are also tied to human responsibility. And it's always tragic to be in a situation where you're considering the loss of another life. But if these conditions are in place and you see that this is a kind of act of self-defense against the innocent, against some aggressor who would otherwise be a grave threat to the innocent, if that deliberation has been done, including if that deliberation has been informed and guided by machine learning, by AI systems, there should still be that human in the loop in the decision-making process, because it also brings about a clearer sense of human responsibility. And that also means that there is a sense of accountability, that this decision has been made, and if it is unjust, there can be an appeal and there can be someone held accountable, a person held accountable for the wrong decision, punished for the wrong decision, rather than leaving us sort of veiled in the opaque algorithmic decision-making process. So I think that human responsibility dimension is key, though again, that can include human decision-making that is informed by and guided by the benefits that come from AI technologies. Then also there's the issue of to what degree the integration of AI is incentivizing or de-incentivizing the very pursuit of war. So certainly there can be cases in which you use the AI well to say, okay, we're going to be more targeted to avoid civilian casualty, to really bring this conflict to as swift a resolution as possible and get to a period of peace. Great. There can also be, unfortunately, the sense that, well, wonderful, we're protecting our own nation's soldiers and we're able to pursue these various objectives. And maybe these objectives include economic benefits, benefits to the extension of our power and so forth. And so, hey, we're not losing as much of our people, but perhaps along the way, we're actually less concerned about the loss of life of the enemies, right? And so maybe the use of the AI systems can de-incentivize those pushes for peace. There's also the concern about to what extent over-reliance in AI and military trivializes the experience or sort of gamifies the experience, where you lose that empathetic connection to the other, right? Where you're able to execute and remove the correct data points, those who are identified as being threats, and you have less opportunity to really see that, well, there's another human person behind that. Even if that human person is maybe doing evil things, there's still another human person in which I can empathize with, one soldier to another. AI systems can very easily distance us from that experience of empathy that might be the key pathway for us to try again paths of peace. So again, it's complicated.
On that point, some of the early experiments with using these LLM models as agents in war games, they get us to DEFCON 5 faster than the human beings do. So they're not necessarily more cautious, even though they could be. And I think they could easily be tweaked to be more cautious. But more immediately, the conflict with China, the US-China rivalry around artificial intelligence, is a principal destabilizing factor in the world. And many people who are concerned about the power of AI have gone doomerist in terms of that AI may itself pose an existential threat to humanity that would supersede any of the geopolitical conflicts that we're currently engaged in, or industrial conflicts over the future of AI. And so, for instance, Bernie Sanders has brought Chinese scientists to Washington, D.C. to talk about the doomerist perspective, that we need to be regulating the more extreme versions of AI. And China has actually adopted recent policies that artificial intelligence should never be programmed to have emotions, something that I think is fascinating, going beyond, they don't currently have them, but saying, and don't ever do it. But so do you think that, the church is often seen by nationalists as hostile to nationalism and on the side of globalism, at least by the paranoid conspiracy theories? Is there an implicit argument here that we should be setting aside some geopolitical risks, even if the document doesn't directly address existential risk, but that because of all the other concerns expressed, that there should be a global conversation that gets us past our current geopolitical rifts?
Yeah, I mean, that's something certainly worth pursuing that I think the church has been pursuing in different capacities. Yeah, I think we recognize that in a globalized world, these technologies are already shaping all people as a sort of human family, and that we could very easily be bringing ourselves to this point of kind of mutual destruction, where, like, even if we win the sort of AGI race, in the rush to do that, we could very well set up the systems that we ourselves are not able to really guide or control, or that bring about situations that we're just not yet prepared for. So that I think there's a real risk of us winning one race, but then ultimately losing out in the end. And basically, creating what we can no longer control, or what we can no longer align with human values. So I think having these conversations and reflections together with different cultures and different societies is going to be key to avoid that kind of mutual destruction.
Father, I know you've been very generous with us and with your time. Maybe let me ask you one last question that I know both Jay and I were very curious about. In the emphasis in the document, the Pope pays a great deal of attention as he writes the encyclical to the dignity of work and impact of automation on job loss and the loss of dignity that people often find dignity and meaning that people find in work. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about the following pushback, which was lots of jobs didn't have dignity before AI. They were unattractive, unfulfilling, and unmeaningful jobs before AI. A lot of people probably wouldn't mind working less and finding their own dignity where they could find it in their hobbies, etc. We might be ill prepared to practice our hobbies because of what we talked about earlier. So I was wondering what you thought, and I know that you, from reading and listening to you and some of the interviews you gave in recent weeks, I know you're sympathetic to some of this at least. What about a focus on the dignity of leisure rather than on the dignity of work?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say both end, right? Like continue the reflection on dignity of work, make sure that it's nuanced to take into account those other points that you bring up, and then also emphasize the dignity of leisure. So I would say that tradition of the church in her social teaching, certainly going back to Pope Leo XIII and even earlier, recognizes that there are forms of work that really dehumanize, that manipulate, that exploit. Pope Leo XIII was well aware of these horrible working hours or working conditions. I mean, he spent a lot of time talking about just wages. And he talked about just wages because there were a lot of unjust wages and a lot of forms of work that were really instrumentalizing other people, and that those conditions needed to be changed. It wasn't enough to just say, hey, you've got some place to be today for a certain number of hours, so you're fine. So I think the very reflection on dignity of work allows for a recognition and actually demands a recognition that there can be these dangerous forms of work. There can also just be drudgery, right? That there can be certain tedious activities that it would be better to spare human beings of. And so if AI can automate some of the most dangerous aspects of our work and also some of the drudgery of our work and free people to pursue activities that might demand more, not less, of their critical thinking, their reflection, their contemplation, their creativity, then all the better. So I think we can shift the forms of work and really allow more people to pursue the kind of meaningful forms of labor that some of us are privileged to engage in already. And then recognizing that if we do reduce the time in which you're formally engaged in work, and I don't know, more people have 30-hour work weeks or 20-hour work weeks or whatever that might look like, then we also have to kind of fill that gap. We have to help people appreciate what it means to pursue activities that are just good in and of themselves, that are meaningful and fulfilling in and of themselves for the good of the person, the good of the community, even if they don't have sort of a clear economic utility or payout. I mean, helping people to appreciate what it's like to read a great book, to discuss it, to compose music, to paint, to contemplate nature, to go on a hike, to engage in different forms of worship, to spend time with each other, to converse, to care for the sick and the frail. I mean, all of those are valuable activities that could very much fill our time instead of, the different ways in which we're already guilty. I'm certainly guilty of squandering the opportunities for leisure. The moments where I'm just, scrolling and doom scrolling. I'm like, this is not what earlier technological geniuses were fighting for. This is not what they wanted to liberate us from. So I think we can learn how to squander less of our time and engage in some of these activities better. And then something to sort of close that I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that the very trends we see toward AI companionship suggest how much we need human connection. And we know how often it's difficult to find those moments of human connection. How many times do people legitimately lament that they can't find the right therapist? They can't find the right psychologist who has the time and has that connection with them to give them more personalized attention. That you can't get to that brilliant professor because he or she is swamped with a lecture hall of 300 students, or the doctor never has enough time to sit down with us and deliver the news in the right way or give us advice in the right way. Like, we're constantly and often legitimately lamenting the fact that people who focus on this kind of meaningful labor that involves human connection, we're constantly lamenting that we don't have enough people to do that and they don't have enough time. But we're also very legitimately concerned about the fact that people are being uprooted and displaced and have to find something else to do with their time because their job or significant aspects of their job is being automated away. I say, well, what if we could devote more time and energy to training, informing, and educating people to really excel in those areas that involve empathy and compassion and connection with others, so that we're meeting those needs. And along the way, people have meaningful forms of labor to do, not because it's boosting the GDP, but because it's just good to do. I often tell people that I've been thinking more and more about how good it is for people to receive those forms of connective work and connective labor, but also just how good it is to give that, to do that ourselves. I benefit from having teachers and mentors who take the time to guide me personally. I benefit from people who sit down and are willing to spend an hour to give me personalized spiritual direction. They're not just, okay, these are the common maxims that are valid for everyone, but like, this is how it applies to you, Father Michael, here and now with your hopes, your dreams, and your struggles. I benefit from that, but I also benefit from doing that for other people. Like, when I enter into that relationship of care and concern in that situation of vulnerability and openness, I'm always learning from the people that I guide, whether that be in a teaching situation or in spiritual direction, or I'm a priest, so I hear confessions. And of course, people appreciate when I take the time to hear their confession, but I benefit when people show examples of humility, when they show examples of courage to really just confront a defect or an issue and take ownership of it. I'm inspired to be a much better person. So if we could shift our education and shift our economy to really privilege that, then I think we're going to have less concern and worry about people losing the sense of meaning of their life because they're not in the factory or they're not in the office 40, 50 hours a week.
We've been speaking with Dr. Father Michael Baggot. He is Associate Professor of Bioethics at the Vatican's University and one of the leading articulators of technology ethics in the Vatican circles. So I think we're going to have to touch base with you again about the autonomous weapons issue, because we're going to be working on that for a couple of years, and it seems to be pretty central to the discussion as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This has really been meaningful and enjoyable labor for both of us. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, sociologist, bioethicist, and the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and by Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and director of UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god, When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.